The chains rattled first. Then came the roar that shook the stone walls of the palace dungeon, a sound so full of pain that even the guards standing outside the iron door took a step back. King Alaric Vantor, once the strongest alpha the kingdom had ever known, was on his knees in the dark, his hands bound in silver-lined shackles that burned his skin with every movement. Only hours ago, he had been standing tall in the council hall, listening to reports from his border scouts. Now he could barely remember his own name. It happened during the evening council meeting. Alaric had taken a single sip from his silver goblet, a drink poured by a servant he trusted, and within minutes, his vision had blurred. His hands had begun to shake. His mind, usually sharp and steady, had folded in on itself like paper crushed by an unseen fist. The council members had watched in horror as their king's eyes changed color, turning a wild amber, and his shoulders had begun to shift beneath his coat, as if his very bones wanted to break free of his body. "He's turning," someone had whispered. "Not turning," another voice, calmer and colder, had said. "Breaking." That voice belonged to Draven, the king's cousin, a man who had spent years standing one step behind the throne, always polite, always patient, always waiting. When Alaric collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping, his claws tearing through his gloves, it was Draven who calmly ordered the guards to restrain him. It was Draven who called for chains laced with silver, chains meant only for wolves who had lost control of their beast and could no longer be trusted among their own pack. No one in that room asked why Draven already knew exactly what kind of chains to use. By midnight, the king who had ruled with fairness and courage for nearly a decade was locked behind iron bars in the lowest level of his own palace, treated like a dangerous animal, instead of the man who had once carried wounded soldiers on his back through a burning battlefield to save their lives. The nobles who once bowed to him now whispered that he had gone mad, that some hidden sickness of the blood had finally caught up to him, that a king who could not control his wolf had no right to sit on a throne. Word spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Some said the king had always been unstable, that his temper had simply broken free at last. Others said it was a curse, punishment from the old gods for some sin no one could name. The truth, hidden in a small vial of poison, and a conversation whispered behind closed doors, remained buried deep, known only to the man who had caused it, and the alchemist who had helped him. Far above the dungeon, in the servants' quarters where the ceilings were low and the fires were small, a young woman named Wren Ashby lay awake listening to the distant sound of guards marching through the halls. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in a kingdom built entirely around alpha strength and beta loyalty. Omegas served, they did not lead, they did not fight. They did not matter, at least not in the eyes of the court. Wren had grown used to being invisible. She swept floors in the eastern wing, carried linens to the laundry, and helped prepare herbal remedies for minor illnesses among the staff. Nobles walked past her without a glance, as if she were part of the furniture. Even other servants sometimes forgot she was in the room. But Wren had learned, over her 19 years in the palace, that being invisible had its own kind of power. People spoke freely in front of someone they believed could not understand what they heard, could not act on what they knew, and certainly could never challenge them. She had seen King Alaric only a handful of times, always from a respectful distance, always with her head bowed as court manners demanded. But there was one memory she carried close, one she had never told anyone. 3 winters ago, during a terrible storm, she had slipped and dropped a tray of dishes in the long hallway outside the throne room. The crash had echoed through the stone corridor, and she had frozen, certain she would be punished, perhaps even dismissed from her position entirely. Alaric had been walking past at that exact moment, deep in conversation with one of his generals. He had stopped, looked at the broken dishes, and the trembling servant girl kneeling to gather the pieces, and instead of scolding her, he had knelt down beside her and helped her pick up the shattered plates with his own hands. "Accidents happen," he had said simply, his voice deep but gentle. "No one is punished in my house for being human." Then he had helped her stand, nodded once, and continued on his way as if nothing unusual had occurred. For Wren, it had been the first time anyone of noble blood had treated her as though she were a person worth kindness, rather than a servant worth ignoring. She had never forgotten it, even as the years passed and she remained exactly where she was, sweeping the same floors, carrying the same linens, invisible to everyone who mattered. That night, as news of the king's collapse spread through the palace like smoke under a door, Ren lay in her narrow bed and felt something she could not quite name. It was not simple curiosity. It was a deep, uneasy feeling that something about the story did not fit together correctly. Kings did not simply lose their minds in the middle of a council meeting without warning. Strong alphas, especially ones as disciplined as Alaric, did not shatter apart from nothing. She thought of Draven, calm and composed, while chaos erupted around him, giving orders as if he had rehearsed them 100 times before. She thought of how quickly the silver chains had appeared, as though someone had already prepared them, waiting for this exact moment. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ren stared at the cracked ceiling above her bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and made a quiet promise to herself. She did not yet know what she would do, or how she would do it, but she knew, deep in her chest, that something was very wrong, and that no one else in this vast, glittering palace seemed willing to ask the questions that needed asking. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the sky thick with clouds that refused to let the sun through. Ren rose before dawn, as she always did, and made her way through the quiet servant corridors toward the kitchens. The palace felt different that day. Guards stood at every corner instead of their usual scattered posts. Nobles who normally slept until mid-morning were already awake, gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed. They say he tried to attack one of the guards. It must be the old sickness, the one that took his father's brother. Draven has already called for a meeting with the regional lords. Ren kept her eyes down and her pace steady, the way she had trained herself to do over the years, but her ears stayed sharp. By the time she reached the kitchen, her mind was spinning with questions. A meeting with the regional lords, so soon after the king's collapse. That was fast, faster than seemed reasonable, unless someone had already been preparing for exactly this outcome. In the kitchen, the head cook, a stout woman named Greta, who had worked in the palace for over 20 years, was barking orders at the younger staff while wringing her hands nervously. She noticed Ren enter and waved her over. "You girl, take this tray down to the healer's quarters. Poor man has been up all night trying to understand what happened to His Majesty. Hurry now, before it gets cold." Ren accepted the tray without hesitation. This was an opportunity, though she did not yet understand exactly what kind. The healer's quarters were located near the lower levels of the palace, not far from the dungeons where the king was now imprisoned. It was a place she rarely had reason to visit, and going there now might let her overhear something useful. The corridors grew quieter and colder as she descended, the warm smells of the kitchen fading behind her, replaced by the damp scent of old stone. She passed 2 guards stationed outside a heavy wooden door, their faces tense and unsmiling. Neither of them looked twice at her. An Omega servant carrying a breakfast tray was beneath their notice, exactly as it had always been. Inside the small chamber that served as the palace healer's workroom, an older man sat hunched over a table covered in glass vials, dried herbs, and open books with yellowed pages. His name was Edwin Marsh, and he had served as the royal healer for over 15 years. His hands trembled slightly as he examined a sample of dark liquid under a small lamp, muttering to himself. "Your breakfast, sir," Ren said quietly, setting the tray down on a clear corner of the table. Edwin barely looked up. "Leave it there, child. Thank you." She should have left immediately. That was the expected behavior, the kind that kept servants safe and unnoticed. But something in the old healer's exhausted, troubled expression made her pause. "Is His Majesty going to recover?" she asked, keeping her voice soft and respectful. Edwin finally glanced up at her, surprised perhaps that a servant had spoken at all. He studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she was worth answering. Whatever he saw in her face must have satisfied him, because he let out a tired sigh and rubbed his eyes. "I do not know," he admitted. "This is not any sickness I have studied before. His pulse is too fast, his body temperature keeps shifting, and there is a strange residue in his blood that I cannot identify, something bitter and metallic that should not be there." Ren's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her expression calm. "A residue, sir? Could it be from something he ate or drank?" Edwin frowned, considering the question. It is possible. I have not yet had the chance to examine what he consumed that evening. Everything happened so quickly, and Lord Draven insisted the investigation into the king's condition be handled quietly, without involving too many hands. He paused, then added almost to himself, strange, that he would want fewer people searching for answers rather than more. The words hung in the air between them. Ren said nothing, but she filed the observation away carefully, the way she filed away every small detail she overheard in this palace. A regent in waiting who wanted the investigation kept quiet. A king who had collapsed suddenly and completely, showing symptoms unlike any known illness, chains that had appeared with impossible speed. "Thank you for your honesty, sir," she said finally, bowing her head and turning to leave. "Wait," Edwin called after her, and she turned back. He studied her again, something thoughtful in his tired eyes. "You have a good ear for listening, girl. What is your name?" "Ren, sir." "Ren," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of it. "If you happen to hear anything unusual around the palace in the coming days, anything at all that seems out of place, you may come find me. I fear I may need more ears than my own to understand what has truly happened to our king." It was an unusual request, coming from a man of his standing, but Ren nodded without hesitation. "I will remember, sir." She left the healer's chamber with her tray empty and her mind full. As she made her way back through the cold stone corridors, she found herself walking past the entrance to the dungeon stairs. 2 guards stood watch there as well, their spears crossed in front of the heavy door that led down into darkness. Somewhere beneath her feet, chained and suffering, was the same man who had once knelt beside a frightened servant girl to help her gather broken dishes without a single word of anger. Ren stopped walking. She stood very still in the corridor, staring at that door, feeling something settle inside her chest, like a stone dropping into still water. She did not know yet what she could possibly do. She was an Omega. She had no rank, no soldiers, no political power, nothing but quiet hands and quick ears, and a memory of one small kindness that most people in this palace would consider too insignificant to matter. But she also knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could not simply return to her chores and pretend she had heard nothing suspicious. Whatever was happening to King Alaric, it was not madness. It was not sickness in the way everyone believed. Someone in this palace wanted the world to think their king had lost his mind, and that same someone had moved with frightening speed to lock him away and take control. She thought of Draven's calm voice ordering the silver chains. She thought of the strange residue in the king's blood that Edwin could not identify. She thought of an investigation being kept deliberately small, deliberately quiet, by the one man who stood to gain the most from the king's downfall. The pieces did not prove anything yet. She understood that. A servant girl's suspicions, built from overheard whispers and quiet coincidences, would mean nothing to anyone who mattered in this palace. If she said a single word of what she suspected to the wrong person, she could lose far more than her position. She could lose her life. And yet, as she stood there in the cold corridor, with the empty tray still in her hands, Ren made a decision that would change everything that followed. She would not speak yet. She would not act rashly or draw attention to herself, but she would watch. She would listen. She would learn everything she could about what had truly happened to her king, no matter how long it took or how much danger it brought. Because somewhere beneath the stone floor she stood on, a good man was chained in the dark, condemned for a crime of madness he had not committed, while the true guilty party walked free through marble halls, accepting sympathy and preparing to claim a throne that was never his to take. Ren turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her steps steady, her face calm, giving nothing away. But inside, something had shifted. The invisible servant girl who had spent her whole life unnoticed had just decided to become something far more dangerous to the people who ruled her world. She had decided to pay attention, and in a palace full of secrets, that alone was enough to change everything. The days that followed moved slowly at first, each one blending into the next in the familiar rhythm of palace life, sweeping, carrying, cleaning, serving meals to nobles who never looked at her twice. But beneath that familiar rhythm, Ren had begun a quiet work of her own, one that no one around her noticed. She started paying closer attention to conversations she would once have let pass by unheard. She began remembering names, dates, small details that seemed unimportant on their own, but might mean something when placed beside other pieces. She learned that Draven had summoned 3 regional lords to the palace within 2 days of the king's collapse, an unusually fast gathering for men who normally took weeks to travel from their distant estates. She learned that the guards who had been present during the council meeting when the king fell ill had been reassigned to distant outposts within a day, scattered so far apart that they could not easily speak with one another about what they had witnessed. She learned that the servant who had poured the king's drink that evening had disappeared entirely, no longer seen anywhere in the palace, his quarters cleared out overnight, as though he had simply vanished. Each piece of information tightened the knot forming in Ren's stomach. This was not the chaos of a sudden, unexpected illness. This was the careful, practiced work of someone who had planned every step long before the poison ever touched the king's lips. One evening, nearly a week after the king's collapse, Ren found herself carrying a stack of folded linens toward the eastern wing when she overheard voices coming from a side chamber, its door left slightly open. She recognized Draven's voice immediately, smooth and unhurried as always. "The council grows restless," he was saying. "They want a decision on the regency soon. We cannot keep saying he might recover forever." A second voice answered, one Ren did not recognize, low and careful, with the faint accent of someone from beyond the kingdom's borders. The compound was designed to hold for many months, perhaps longer, depending on his strength. "You said yourself he was stronger than most alphas you have dealt with." "Yes," Draven replied, an edge of irritation creeping into his tone. "Which is exactly why I need reassurance. If he begins to recover on his own, all of this becomes far more complicated." "He will not recover on his own," the stranger said firmly. "Not without the proper cure. And that cure requires an ingredient found only in the Blackthorn Wilds, a place few dare to enter, and fewer still return from. Your cousin's fate is sealed, my lord, unless someone foolish enough to risk their life goes looking for a cure no one else even knows exists." Ren stood frozen in the corridor, her arms full of linens, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might somehow hear it through the door. She had her answer now, or at least the beginning of one. The king had been poisoned deliberately, by Draven's own arrangement, using some kind of compound meant to trap him in his wolf form and make him appear mad, and there was a cure, hidden away in a dangerous, forbidden place called the Blackthorn Wilds. She did not wait to hear more. Moving as quietly as her trembling legs would allow, she backed away from the door and hurried down the corridor, turning the corner just as she heard footsteps approaching from inside the chamber. She pressed herself against the shadowed wall of an adjoining hallway and waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps faded into silence. When she was certain she was alone again, Ren allowed herself a single shaky breath. Her hands were trembling so badly that one of the linens slipped from her arms and fell to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, and as she did, she caught sight of her own reflection in a polished silver mirror hanging on the corridor wall, an unremarkable servant girl in a plain gray dress, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her eyes wide with fear, and something else, something that had not been there before. Determination. She thought of Edwin Marsh, the tired healer who had asked her to bring him anything unusual she happened to hear. She thought of King Alaric, chained in darkness beneath the very halls she now stood in, suffering for a crime that was never his. She thought of the strength it had taken for a king to kneel beside a frightened servant girl and treat her with simple human kindness when no one else in the palace would have bothered. Ren gathered the fallen linen from the floor, straightened her dress, and continued walking toward the eastern wing, as though nothing at all had happened. But her mind was already racing ahead, already planning her next move. She needed to speak with Edwin Marsh, carefully and privately, without drawing any attention to herself. She needed to learn everything she could about this Blackthorn Wilds and the cure that supposedly waited there. And somehow, in a palace now controlled by a man willing to poison his own cousin for power, she needed to find a way to help a chained king reclaim the throne that rightfully belonged to him. It seemed impossible. She was, after all, nothing more than an Omega servant, invisible, and powerless in the eyes of everyone who held real authority in this kingdom. But as she walked through the quiet corridors that evening, carrying her linens toward the eastern wing, Ren felt something settle firmly in her chest, something steady and unshakable. She may have been invisible. She may have been considered weak by every noble who passed her in the halls without a second glance. But invisible people heard things that others missed. Weak people were underestimated by those who never imagined they might fight back. And somewhere in that quiet, dangerous truth, Ren began to believe that she might be exactly the kind of person this broken, poisoned kingdom needed most, the one no one would ever suspect of being brave enough to save it. That night, as the palace settled into its usual uneasy silence, Ren lay awake once again, staring at the cracked ceiling above her narrow bed. But this time, her mind was not spinning with confusion and fear. It was building, piece by piece, the beginning of a plan. She did not know yet how she would find the courage to walk into the Blackthorn Wilds, or how she would convince anyone to believe her suspicions about Draven, or how she would ever get close enough to the Chained King to help him at all. But she knew where to start. In the morning, she would find Edwin Marsh, and together, they would begin to unravel the truth hidden beneath the palace's glittering marble floors, one careful thread at a time, until the whole rotten tapestry of Draven's betrayal came undone in the light for everyone to see. Outside her small window, the moon rose pale and full over the palace towers, casting long silver shadows across the stone courtyard below. Somewhere beneath those same stones, in a cold, dark cell, a king who did not yet know he had an ally continued to fight against chains that burned his skin and a curse that stole his mind. He had no way of knowing that hope, small and quiet and easily overlooked, had already begun moving through the halls above him, wearing the plain gray dress of a servant girl no one had ever thought to notice. Morning came with a thin gray light that barely pushed through the clouds hanging low over the palace towers. Ren rose earlier than usual, her body tense with a nervous energy she had not felt in years. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and slipped out of the servants' quarters before most of the staff had even begun to stir. Her plan was simple in shape, but dangerous in every detail. She needed to reach Edwin Marsh without anyone noticing, tell him what she had overheard, and decide together what to do next. The corridors were nearly empty at this hour, lit only by the last of the night's candles burning low in their iron holders. Ren moved quickly and quietly, keeping close to the walls out of old habit, though her mind was far from calm. Every echo of her own footsteps seemed too loud. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching eye. She reminded herself, again and again, that she was simply a servant girl, walking to deliver morning supplies, a sight so common in this palace that no one would think twice about it. She reached the healer's chamber just as Edwin was lighting the first lamp of the day. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his tired face. "You are here early, Ren. I need to speak with you, sir." Privately. Her voice was low, urgent enough that Edwin's expression shifted from surprise to concern. He glanced toward the door, then crossed the room and closed it gently, turning the small iron latch. "Tell me," he said simply. Ren took a steadying breath and told him everything, the voices she had overheard the night before, Draven's impatience with the council, the stranger's mention of a compound designed to trap the king in his wolf form, and the cure hidden somewhere in a place called the Blackthorn Wilds. She spoke quickly but clearly, careful to leave nothing out, watching Edwin's face grow paler with every word. When she finished, the old healer sank slowly into his chair, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "By the old gods," he whispered, "I suspected something was wrong, but I never imagined it went this deep." He looked up at her, his eyes sharp despite his exhaustion. "You are certain of what you heard? Every word?" "I am certain, sir. I would not have come to you otherwise." Edwin nodded slowly, then reached for one of the open books on his table, flipping through its yellowed pages with quick, practiced fingers. "The Blackthorn Wilds," he murmured. "I have read of that place in old texts, though I always believed it to be more legend than fact. A forest beyond the northern border, said to be filled with plants and creatures found nowhere else in the known world. Dangerous, yes, but also rich with rare medicines that cannot be found anywhere in civilized lands." He paused, studying one particular page closely. If a cure for this kind of compound exists, it is entirely possible it would come from a place like that. "Then we need to find out exactly what ingredient is needed," Ren said. "And we need to find it before Draven can convince the council to make him permanent regent." Edwin looked at her carefully. something like respect beginning to show in his tired eyes. "You speak as though you intend to be part of this, Ren." "I do intend to be part of this," she said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "His Majesty was kind to me once, when he had no reason to be, and nothing to gain from it. I cannot stand by and do nothing, while his own cousin poisons him and steals his throne." For a long moment, Edwin said nothing, simply studying her face as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. But we must move carefully, and we cannot do this alone. I know of one other person in this palace who might help us, someone with skills we will need if we hope to succeed." That afternoon, under the pretense of delivering medicine to the palace stables, Edwin introduced Ren to a man named Callum Brooks, a former royal guard who had served under King Alaric for many years, before being quietly dismissed from his position shortly after the king's collapse. Callum was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of watchful eyes that came from years of standing guard over people more important than himself. He had been reassigned to menial duties in the stables, a clear insult meant to push him toward resignation, though he had stubbornly refused to leave the palace grounds entirely. "Edwin tells me you have information about what really happened to the king," Callum said, his voice low as the three of them stood near the horse stalls, the smell of hay and leather thick in the air around them. Ren repeated what she had overheard, watching Callum's jaw tighten with barely controlled anger as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward the palace walls rising in the distance. "I always knew something was wrong," he said finally. "The night it happened, I was one of the guards stationed near the council hall. I saw the way Draven moved, how calm he was, how quickly he had those chains brought in. At the time, I told myself he was simply a man keeping his head during a crisis. Now I understand he was executing a plan he had prepared long before that night." He turned to look at Ren directly. "You risk your life speaking of this to anyone, including us. Why would you take such a risk for a king you barely know?" Ren met his gaze steadily. "Because he was kind to me once, when kindness cost him nothing, and gained him nothing either. And because someone in this palace needs to care more about what is right than what is safe." Something shifted in Callum's expression, a flicker of genuine respect breaking through his guarded caution. "Then I will help you," he said. "I have friends among the remaining guards, men who still believe in their king. I cannot promise how many will risk themselves openly, but I can gather information, and I can help protect you both if this plan moves forward." Over the following days, the three of them began meeting in secret, always in different locations around the palace grounds, always careful never to be seen together too often or for too long. Edwin continued researching the Blackthorn wilds, poring over old texts and maps late into the night, searching for any mention of the specific ingredient that might counter the poison running through the king's blood. Callum used his old connections among the guards to gather small pieces of information, learning which soldiers remained loyal to Alaric, and which had already begun currying favor with Draven in hopes of advancement. Ren continued her quiet work as well, moving unnoticed through the palace, listening at doors, remembering conversations, piecing together the growing picture of Draven's careful betrayal. It was dangerous work, and the danger grew sharper with each passing day. Draven had begun tightening his control over the palace, replacing guards loyal to the old king with men he trusted personally, restricting access to certain wings of the building, and holding private meetings with the regional lords that excluded anyone he considered even slightly suspicious. The council, still uncertain what to make of their king's condition, had begun leaning toward Draven's suggestion that a temporary regency be established, one that Draven himself would naturally lead until the king either recovered or, as Draven quietly suggested in private conversations, until it became clear he never would. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after Ren had first overheard Draven's conversation with the mysterious stranger, Edwin finally found what he had been searching for. He called Ren and Callum to his chamber late at night, his eyes bright with exhausted excitement, as he spread an old, fragile map across his table. "Here," he said, pointing to a marked location deep within the forest region north of the kingdom's border. "A plant called Moonveil Root, mentioned in this old healing text as the only known cure for compounds that trap a shifter between forms. It grows only in the deepest parts of the Blackthorn wilds, near a place called the Hollow Stones. The text warns that the journey is dangerous, filled with rogue wolves who have abandoned all pack loyalty, and creatures unknown to civilized lands. But it also confirms that the route, properly prepared, can reverse even the most severe cases of forced transformation. Ren studied the map carefully, memorizing the path as best she could. "Then that is where we must go," she said quietly. Callum frowned, glancing between Ren and the map. "The journey alone will take days, perhaps longer, and that is assuming nothing goes wrong along the way. This is no place for someone untrained in such dangers." "I understand the risk," Ren said, meeting his eyes steadily. "But I also understand that every day we wait, Draven grows stronger, and his majesty grows weaker. If there is even a chance this route can save him, I intend to find it, whether or not I have help." Something in her tone must have convinced Callum, because after a long moment of consideration, he sighed and nodded. "Then I will come with you. Someone with fighting skill needs to accompany you into those woods, and Edwin cannot be spared from the palace without raising suspicion. He must remain here, continuing his official duties, preparing the antidote once we return with the route, and watching for any sign that Draven suspects what we are planning." Edwin nodded in agreement, though worry lined his weathered face. "I will do everything I can from here. But you two must be careful. If either of you is discovered, if Draven learns even a hint of what you intend to do, he will not hesitate to silence you both permanently. He has already made one servant disappear without a trace. He would not think twice about doing the same to either of you." The weight of that warning settled heavily over the small room. Ren thought of the servant who had poured the king's poisoned drink, vanished so completely that no one in the palace even spoke of him anymore, as though he had simply ceased to exist. She thought of how easily that same fate could befall her, or Callum, if their plan was discovered before they ever had the chance to help the king. But she also thought of Alaric, chained in darkness beneath the palace, suffering for a crime he had never committed, trapped between man and wolf, by a poison meant to destroy him slowly and completely. She thought of the kindness he had shown her 3 winters ago, kneeling to help a frightened servant girl gather broken dishes without a single harsh word. If their positions had been reversed, she believed with certainty that he would have done everything in his power to help her, regardless of the danger to himself. "We will be careful," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "But we will not stop. Too much is at stake to turn back now." Callum nodded firmly in agreement, and even Edwin, worried as he was, seemed to accept that there was no other path forward. The 3 of them spent the rest of that night finalizing their plans, deciding how Ren and Callum would slip away from the palace without drawing attention, what supplies they would need for the dangerous journey ahead, and how they would communicate with Edwin once they departed into the unknown dangers of the Blackthorn Wilds. As dawn began to break over the palace towers, painting the sky in soft shades of gray and gold, Ren finally returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, her mind racing with everything that lay ahead. She had never left the palace grounds before, had never traveled beyond the familiar streets of the capital city, let alone ventured into a dangerous, unmapped forest filled with rogue wolves and unknown creatures. Fear pressed heavily against her chest, cold and undeniable. But beneath that fear, something else burned steadily, something that felt almost like purpose. For the first time in her entire life, Ren was not simply following orders or fading quietly into the background of someone else's story. She was choosing, deliberately and with full understanding of the danger, to step forward and fight for something she believed mattered, even though every rule of this kingdom told her that Omegas like her were never meant to matter at all. She thought of Alaric's chains, cold and burning against his skin, and of Draven's calm, patient voice, giving orders that would strip an innocent king of everything he had ever built. She thought of the long, dangerous road ahead, the hollow stones hidden somewhere deep within a forest that swallowed careless travelers whole. Whatever came next, whatever dangers waited in those dark woods, Ren understood clearly that she could not turn back now. The path had already been chosen, not by fate or by anyone else's expectations, but by her own quiet, unshakable decision to matter, regardless of what the world had always told her about people like her. As the sun finally rose fully over the palace, casting warm golden light across the stone courtyards below, Ren closed her eyes and allowed herself one final moment of rest before the true journey began. Somewhere beneath her, in the cold darkness of the dungeon, a chained king continued to fight against a curse he did not understand, unaware that far above him, 3 unlikely allies had already begun building the foundation of his rescue, one careful, dangerous step at a time. Before she could leave the palace grounds for the dangerous road ahead, Ren knew there was one thing she needed to do first, something she had thought about every night since the king's collapse, but had never found the courage to attempt. She needed to see him. Not from a distance, not through whispered rumors carried by frightened servants, but with her own eyes, close enough to know for certain that the man she was risking everything to save was still, somewhere beneath the curse, the same person who had once knelt to help her gather broken dishes. The dungeon entrance was guarded day and night, 2 soldiers always stationed at the heavy wooden door, spears crossed and expressions stern. Getting past them directly was impossible. But Ren had spent years learning the palace's hidden pathways, the narrow servant corridors built centuries ago, for staff to move unseen while carrying meals, laundry, and firewood without disturbing the nobles who lived above them. One such passage, she knew, ran directly beneath the eastern wing and connected to a small maintenance door near the lower dungeon levels, rarely used and easily overlooked by guards who had never needed to consider it a threat. Late that night, after the palace had settled into its heaviest silence, Ren slipped from her room, carrying a small lantern shielded carefully to hide most of its light. Her heart pounded steadily as she made her way through the narrow stone passage, her fingers trailing along the rough wall to guide her through the near-total darkness. The air grew colder and damper the further she descended, until finally she reached the small maintenance door, its hinges rusted from disuse. She pushed it open slowly, wincing at the faint creak it made, and found herself standing at the edge of the dungeon's lowest level. A single torch burned in a distant bracket, casting long, flickering shadows across the damp stone floor. She could hear it before she saw it, a low, ragged breathing sound coming from the farthest cell, heavy and strained, like something caught between 2 different kinds of pain. Ren crept forward carefully, staying close to the wall, until she reached the iron bars of the last cell. What she saw took her breath away. King Alaric Vantor, once tall and powerful, commanding respect simply by entering a room, now knelt on the cold stone floor, his broad shoulders hunched forward, his body trembling with barely controlled tremors. His clothing had been torn away in places, revealing patches of fur beginning to sprout unnaturally along his arms and back, a body caught helplessly between man and wolf, unable to complete either transformation. Silver chains bound his wrists to the wall, and where the metal touched his skin, angry red burns marked him deeply, a cruel punishment for a curse he had never chosen. For a long moment, Ren simply stood there, staring through the bars, her chest tight with a grief she had not expected to feel so strongly. This was not the proud, composed king she remembered from years ago. This was a man being slowly destroyed by poison and betrayal, abandoned by everyone who should have fought for him. His head lifted slowly, amber eyes finding her through the darkness. For a moment, those eyes held nothing but wild, feral confusion, the look of a cornered animal rather than a man. Ren's breath caught in her throat, fear rising sharply. Perhaps the compound had already destroyed too much of him. Perhaps there was no man left inside that broken, trembling body to save. But then something shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing, clearing just enough that Ren could see a flicker of genuine awareness beneath the wild haze. He tilted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as though trying to place a familiar scent. "You," he rasped, his voice rough and broken, barely recognizable as the deep, steady voice she remembered from years ago. "I know you." Ren stepped closer to the bars, careful to stay just out of reach, though something in her instincts told her this man, even in his current state, would never intentionally harm her. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "you may not remember, but 3 winters ago, you helped me pick up broken dishes in the eastern hallway. You told me that no one is punished in your house for being human." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by his ragged breathing. Then, slowly, something like recognition flickered across his strained features. "The servant girl," he murmured, his voice cracking with the effort of speaking clearly. "Ren, your name is Ren." Relief flooded through her chest, so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she breathed. "You remember." "Parts of me remember," he said, his voice growing steadier, though the effort clearly cost him. "Parts of me are still lost in something dark, something that keeps pulling me away from myself. I do not understand what has happened to me." "You were poisoned," Ren said quietly, glancing back over her shoulder toward the maintenance door, listening carefully for any sign of approaching guards. "By your own cousin, Your Majesty. Draven arranged this, with the help of an alchemist. There is a cure, but it requires an ingredient found only in a place called the Blackthorn Wilds. I intend to find it." Alaric's eyes widened slightly, sharpening further with each word she spoke, as though the truth itself was helping him claw his way back toward clarity. "Draven," he repeated, a low growl building in his throat, though this time it sounded less like feral confusion and more like genuine anger, the anger of a man beginning to understand exactly how deeply he had been betrayed. "I should have seen it. I trusted him. I gave him more power than any cousin deserved, and he used that trust to destroy me." "You could not have known," Ren said gently. He hid his intentions well, even from those closest to him. The king studied her carefully, something like disbelief crossing his strained features. "Why would you risk everything to help me? You are a servant. This is not your fight." Ren straightened slightly, meeting his gaze steadily despite the bars separating them and the danger surrounding this entire conversation. "Because you showed me kindness when you had nothing to gain from it. Because a kingdom ruled by a man willing to poison his own family for power is not a kingdom worth allowing to stand, and because I refuse to believe that simply being born an Omega means I am incapable of doing what is right." Her voice grew firmer with each word. "I intend to travel into the Blackthorn Wilds to find the cure that can save you, Your Majesty. I have allies helping me, a healer and a former guard, both loyal to you still. We will not fail." For a long moment, Alaric simply stared at her, something complicated moving behind his amber eyes, respect and disbelief, and something that looked almost like hope, all tangled together. "You would risk your life for a king you barely know," he said quietly, "in a forest that has swallowed trained soldiers whole and never returned them." "I would risk my life for what is right," Ren corrected gently. "You simply happen to be the person that requires saving this time." A faint, exhausted smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine expression she had seen from him since arriving. "Then, I owe you a debt I may never be able to repay, Ren. Should you succeed in this impossible task, know that I will not forget what you have done. Focus on surviving until we return, Your Majesty," she said, allowing herself a small smile in return. "That will be repayment enough." A distant sound echoed through the dungeon corridor, footsteps approaching from somewhere above, growing steadily louder. Ren's heart leapt with sudden panic. She could not be found here, not now, not when everything depended on remaining unseen and unsuspected. "I must go," she whispered urgently. "Please, hold on. We will return with the cure as quickly as we possibly can." Alaric nodded, understanding immediately, his expression shifting back toward the controlled calm of a man determined to endure whatever pain remained ahead of him. "Be careful," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever waits in those woods, do not underestimate it." Ren gave him one last look, memorizing the sight of him, chained and suffering, yet somehow still radiating quiet strength, before turning and slipping back through the maintenance door, just as the footsteps grew dangerously close. She pressed herself into the shadowed passage, holding her breath, listening, as two guards passed by on their nightly rounds, their voices low and bored, completely unaware of how close they had come to discovering her. Only once their footsteps had faded completely did Ren allow herself to breathe normally again. She made her way back through the narrow servant passages, her mind still full of the image of Alaric kneeling in that cold cell, chained and broken, yet still somehow himself beneath the curse that gripped him. The conversation had changed something in her, transformed her mission from an abstract sense of duty into something deeply personal. She was no longer simply fighting against an injustice she had witnessed. She was fighting for a specific man who had recognized her, remembered her small kindness, and trusted her with the truth of his suffering. When she finally returned to her small room, dawn was still hours away, but sleep felt impossible. She lay awake, staring at the familiar cracked ceiling above her bed, running through everything that needed to happen before she and Callum could depart for the Blackthorn Wilds. Supplies needed to be gathered quietly, without drawing suspicion from the palace stewards who tracked such things carefully. A believable excuse needed to be prepared for her absence, something that would not immediately alert Draven's growing network of loyal guards and informants. And somehow, she needed to find the courage to walk willingly into a forest known for swallowing trained soldiers whole and never returning them. Fear pressed heavily against her chest as she considered everything that could go wrong, every way this dangerous plan could fail and leave Alaric trapped forever in his half-formed curse, while Draven claimed the throne uncontested. But beneath that fear, the memory of the king's exhausted, grateful smile remained steady and clear, a small flame of resolve that refused to be extinguished by doubt. She thought of his words, spoken with such quiet certainty despite his suffering. Whatever waits in those woods, do not underestimate it. She intended to heed that warning carefully, but she also intended to prove, through actions rather than words, that being underestimated by others did not mean she should ever underestimate herself. As the first pale light of dawn finally began creeping through her small window, Ren rose from her bed, dressed quickly, and began the careful work of preparing for the journey ahead, each small task bringing her one step closer to the moment she would walk out of the palace gates and into the unknown dangers of the Blackthorn Wilds, carrying with her the fragile hope of an entire kingdom and the quiet, unshakable memory of a chained king who had called her brave. The days leading up to their departure proved far more dangerous than Ren had anticipated. Draven's grip on the palace tightened with each passing day, and along with that tightening grip came an atmosphere of suspicion that seemed to seep into every corner of the building. Servants who had once gossiped freely now spoke in careful, guarded tones, aware that loose words could easily be reported to someone eager to prove their loyalty to the rising regent. Ren understood this danger intimately, since she herself was attempting to move through the palace unnoticed, while gathering supplies and information for a mission that could see her executed if discovered. The greatest threat came from an unexpected direction. Among the household staff was a young servant named Mira Doyle, ambitious and sharp-eyed, who had recently begun seeking favor with members of Draven's expanding circle of trusted attendants. Mira had never been particularly close to Ren, though they had worked alongside each other for several years in the Eastern Wing, where Ren had always kept to herself. Quiet and unremarkable, Mira had spent her years in service, carefully studying which servants rose in status and which remained forgotten, determined never to be counted among the forgotten herself. It was Mira who first noticed something different about Ren's behavior. She noticed Ren slipping away during hours when she should have been performing her usual duties. She noticed small supplies disappearing from the kitchen stores, dried meats and traveling bread, that had no obvious purpose within the palace. She noticed Ren speaking quietly with Callum Brooks near the stables on more than one occasion, an unusual pairing that drew her curious attention. 3 days before Ren and Callum planned to depart, Mira approached Ren directly in the linen storage room, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with calculation. "You have been acting strangely lately," Mira said, leaning casually against the doorframe, blocking the only exit, sneaking away during work hours, meeting with that dismissed guard by the stables, taking supplies that seemed to have no purpose here in the palace. Her lips curved into a thin, knowing smile. "I wonder what Lord Draven would think if he learned one of his servants was behaving so suspiciously." Ren's stomach dropped, but she forced her expression to remain calm, drawing on years of practice, hiding her true feelings behind a servant's blank composure. "I do not know what you mean, Mira. I have simply been running errands for the healer, gathering supplies for his remedies." "Have you?" Mira said skeptically, pushing off from the doorframe and stepping further into the room, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Because it seems to me that a healer's errands would not require quite so much secrecy, nor quite so many private conversations with a man who was dismissed from royal service under suspicious circumstances." She paused, studying Ren's face carefully. "Tell me the truth, and perhaps I will keep your secret." Lord Draven has been generous to those who prove useful to him. Perhaps you and I could both benefit from an arrangement, if you were willing to share exactly what you have been planning." The offer hung in the air between them, a clear invitation to betray everything Ren had worked so carefully to protect. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her, the sudden, terrifying realization that everything could unravel here, in this small storage room, because of one ambitious servant seeking advancement. But Ren had spent years learning to think clearly under pressure, watching and listening, while others assumed her incapable of understanding the deeper currents moving around her. She drew on that same careful patience now, forcing her voice to remain steady and slightly confused, as though genuinely puzzled by the accusation. "Mira, I think you are imagining conspiracies where none exist," she said, allowing a note of gentle concern to enter her voice, the tone one might use with a friend who seemed unwell. "Edwin Marsh has been overwhelmed since His Majesty's collapse, tending to increase duties across the entire palace. He asked for my help specifically because I am reliable and unlikely to gossip about what I see in his chambers, unlike some of the other staff." She let that observation land pointedly before continuing. "As for Callum Brooks, he has been assisting with deliveries to the stable, and yes, we have spoken while I pass through on errands. There is nothing more to it than simple courtesy between co-workers." Mira's confident expression flickered slightly, uncertainty creeping into her sharp eyes. Ren pressed her advantage carefully, keeping her tone light and unbothered. "If you truly believe something suspicious is happening, perhaps you should bring your concerns directly to Lord Draven, rather than to me," Ren continued, watching Mira's face carefully. "Though I would think carefully before doing so. Accusing a fellow servant of conspiracy based on nothing more than errands and idle chatting might make Lord Draven question your judgment rather than reward your loyalty. He values servants who bring him solid, useful information, not servants who waste his time with baseless suspicion." The warning landed exactly as Ren had hoped. Mira's confident posture wavered, clearly recalculating the risk of pursuing an accusation that might backfire and damage her own standing rather than elevate it. Ambition, Ren had learned from watching countless nobles and servants alike, often made people cautious as much as it made them bold, since the fear of failure weighed just as heavily as the desire for reward. "Perhaps I was mistaken," Mira said finally, though her eyes remained narrowed with lingering suspicion. "But I will be watching you closely, Ren. If I discover you have lied to me, I will not hesitate to bring what I know to Lord Draven's attention, regardless of how it might reflect on my own judgment." "I have nothing to hide," Ren said calmly, holding Mira's gaze steadily until the other servant finally turned and left the storage room, her footsteps sharp and irritated against the stone floor. Only once she was completely alone did Ren allow her carefully composed expression to crack, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned against the shelves of folded linens, her heart pounding rapidly in her chest. That encounter had been close, far too close, and it confirmed exactly what Edwin had warned them about from the very beginning. Draven's influence had spread throughout the palace like a slow, poisonous fog, turning servants against each other, rewarding suspicion and betrayal over loyalty and trust. She needed to warn Callum and Edwin immediately. If Mira decided to watch her more closely, as she had threatened, their remaining time to prepare for departure had just grown significantly shorter and more dangerous. She found Callum later that evening near the stables, currently his primary assigned duty since his demotion from Royal Guard. She explained quickly and quietly what had happened with Mira, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as she spoke. "This changes things," he said, once she finished, glancing around carefully to ensure no one else was within hearing distance. "We cannot risk waiting the full 3 days we originally planned. If this servant continues watching you, continues gathering suspicions to bring to Draven, we may not have the luxury of careful preparation any longer. Edwin still needs time to finish preparing everything we will need for the antidote once we return," Ren said, worry creasing her forehead. "And we have not yet finished gathering all the supplies necessary for the journey itself." Callum considered this for a long moment, his jaw tight with concentration. "Then we move faster. Tomorrow night, instead of waiting the full 3 days, I will gather what remaining supplies I can through my own connections among the loyal guards, men who owe me favors from my years of service. You focus on avoiding Mira's suspicion as much as possible, keep your usual routine exactly as it has always been, and give her no further reason to watch you closely. Ren nodded, though anxiety tightened in her stomach at the sudden acceleration of their timeline. What about Edwin? Will he be ready? He will have to be, Callum said grimly. We cannot afford to wait for perfect conditions any longer. Every day we delay is another day Draven strengthens his hold on this palace, and another day His Majesty suffers in that cell. They agreed to meet Edwin that same night, informing him of the accelerated timeline and finalizing the last details of their departure. Edwin, though clearly anxious about the compressed schedule, agreed that the change was necessary given the new danger of Mira's suspicion. He promised to have everything prepared on his end by the following evening, including a small quantity of a temporary stabilizing draft that might, at least partially, slow the progression of the curse within Alaric's body while they traveled to retrieve the true cure. The following day passed with excruciating slowness for Ren, every moment filled with the tense awareness that Mira might be watching her from some hidden corner of the palace, waiting for any sign of suspicious behavior that could be reported. She forced herself to maintain her usual routine, with careful precision, sweeping the same floors, carrying the same linens, speaking to no one beyond brief, ordinary pleasantries, giving Mira nothing new to observe or report. By the time evening fell, Ren's nerves felt stretched nearly to their breaking point. She met Callum at the agreed location, a small storage shed near the outer palace wall, rarely used and far enough from the main servants' quarters to avoid casual observation. Edwin arrived shortly after, carrying a small leather satchel filled with supplies, his expression tight with worry, but also resolve. This is everything I could prepare on such short notice, he said, handing Ren a smaller pouch containing dried provisions, a compass, and a carefully wrapped vial of the stabilizing draft meant for the king. The draft will not cure him, but it may buy him additional time, slowing the curse's progression enough to keep him stable until you return with the Moonveil route. How will we get it to him? Ren asked, tucking the pouch carefully into her traveling bag. I will handle that, Edwin said. I have legitimate reason to visit the dungeon regularly under the guise of monitoring his condition. Draven has not yet restricted my access, likely because he sees no threat in an old healer's routine visits. A grim smile crossed his tired face. He underestimates how much damage a determined old man with the right knowledge can accomplish. Callum nodded approvingly, then turned to Ren, his expression serious. Once we leave tonight, there is no turning back easily. The journey to the Blackthorn Wilds will take several days on foot, longer if weather or terrain slows us. We must move quickly, quietly, and carefully, avoiding both Draven's scouts along the northern roads and whatever dangers wait within the forest itself. Ren nodded, gathering her courage despite the fear still coiled tightly in her stomach. I am ready. One more thing, Edwin said, reaching into his satchel and producing a small, worn map, different from the one he had shown them previously, marked with additional notes he had discovered in his research. This shows the safest known path through the outer regions of the forest, based on old traveler accounts. It will not guarantee your safety, but it should help you avoid the most dangerous areas closest to the forest's edge. Ren accepted the map carefully, tucking it alongside the other supplies in her bag. As she did, Edwin placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his tired eyes filled with genuine concern. Be careful, both of you, he said quietly. This kingdom cannot afford to lose either of you, and neither can I. With final farewells exchanged and last-minute instructions confirmed, Ren and Callum slipped away from the palace grounds under the cover of darkness, moving carefully through a rarely used service gate that Callum had arranged to leave unlocked through one of his remaining loyal contacts among the guards. As the massive palace walls disappeared behind them into the night, swallowed by darkness and distance, Ren felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration settling over her. She was leaving behind everything familiar, the only home she had ever known, to venture into a dangerous, unmapped forest in search of a cure that might not even exist in the quantities they needed, might not even work as the old texts suggested, might cost both her and Callum their lives before they ever had the chance to save their king. But somewhere behind her, in the cold darkness of a palace dungeon, Alaric Vantor continued fighting against a curse designed to break him completely. holding on to whatever fragile hope her promise had given him. Ren thought of his exhausted, grateful smile, the quiet strength radiating from him even in his weakest moment, and found her resolve hardening into something unshakable. Whatever waited for them in the Blackthorn Wilds, whatever dangers the forest held, she would not turn back now. Too much depended on their success, and too many people, an entire kingdom in fact, needed her to prove that even someone the world considered weak could summon the courage necessary to change everything. The road north stretched long and empty beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the kind of gray, featureless expanse that made it difficult to judge the passage of time. Ren and Callum walked steadily, keeping to smaller paths and forest trails rather than the main road, wary of encountering any of Draven's scouts who might recognize a former royal guard traveling with an unfamiliar servant girl. Callum moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years training for exactly this kind of careful, dangerous travel, while Ren, unaccustomed to long journeys on foot, found herself struggling to match his pace during the first day. "You are doing well," Callum told her during their first evening camp, noticing her exhaustion, though she tried to hide it. Most people who have spent their lives within palace walls would be complaining constantly by now. "I do not have the luxury of complaining," Ren replied, rubbing her sore feet as she sat near their small, carefully hidden fire. "Every moment I spend feeling sorry for myself is a moment His Majesty spends suffering in that cell." Callum studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his weathered features. "You care for him deeply, for someone who has spoken with him only once before this entire situation began." "I care about what is right," Ren said, though she considered his observation carefully before continuing. "But I suppose I also care about him specifically, yes. He showed me a kindness that most nobles would never have bothered offering someone in my position. That kindness revealed something important about his character, something worth protecting." They continued their conversation quietly, as the fire burned low, sharing stories from their very different lives within the same palace walls. Callum spoke of his years training as a royal guard, the pride he had felt serving under a king who treated his soldiers with genuine respect rather than simple authority. Ren spoke of her years growing up as an Omega in a kingdom that offered people like her few opportunities beyond quiet service, the constant awareness of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed by nearly everyone she encountered. "You are stronger than most people realize," Callum said eventually, his voice carrying quiet sincerity. "I have served alongside many soldiers who would have hesitated to attempt what you are doing now, walking willingly into danger for someone else's sake." Ren felt a warm flush of something like pride at his words, though she quickly deflected the compliment, uncomfortable with praise she had rarely received in her life. "We should rest," she said instead. "Tomorrow we reach the forest's edge, and I imagine we will need all our strength for what comes next." They rose before dawn the following morning, continuing their journey north as the landscape gradually shifted from open farmland to increasingly dense woodland. By midday, the trees around them had grown taller and closer together, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked much of the pale sunlight, casting the forest floor in perpetual shadow. Ren felt a growing unease settling over her as they walked, an instinctive awareness that they were entering territory far more dangerous than anything she had experienced before. "We are close now," Callum said, consulting Edwin's map carefully. "The Blackthorn Wilds begin just beyond this next ridge." As they crested the small hill, the forest ahead of them changed dramatically. The trees grew twisted and dark, their bark black as though scorched by some ancient fire, their branches reaching upward like grasping claws against the gray sky. A heavy silence hung over the entire area, unnatural and unsettling, the complete absence of birdsong or any other sign of ordinary forest life. "This is it," Callum murmured, his hand instinctively moving toward the sword at his hip. "The Blackthorn Wilds." Ren stared at the dark tree line stretching before them, fear tightening in her chest. Everything she had heard about this place suggested danger and death waited within those shadows, yet somewhere deep inside that forest grew the only cure capable of saving King Alaric from the curse, slowly destroying him. There was no other choice but to continue forward. "Let us move quickly," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "The sooner we find the Moonvale route, the sooner we can return to help His Majesty." They entered the forest cautiously, Callum leading the way with his sword drawn, Ren following close behind, her senses heightened by fear and adrenaline. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably the moment they passed beneath the first twisted trees, the air growing colder and heavier, carrying a faint, unpleasant scent of decay. Shadows seemed to shift and move at the edges of their vision, though whenever they turned to look directly, nothing was ever visibly there. "Stay close to me," Callum instructed quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness around them constantly. Edwin's notes mentioned rogue wolves inhabiting this forest, creatures that have abandoned pack loyalty entirely and now hunt purely on instinct. They can be extremely dangerous, particularly to travelers who wander alone or appear vulnerable. Ren nodded, keeping close behind him as they navigated deeper into the increasingly dark and twisted woodland. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the gradual dimming of what little light penetrated the thick canopy above them. The path grew increasingly difficult to follow, the map Edwin had provided proving less reliable the deeper they traveled, forcing them to rely more heavily on instinct and careful observation of natural landmarks. As evening approached, bringing with it an even deeper darkness beneath the twisted trees, they heard it for the first time, a low, distant howl echoing through the forest, followed shortly by another, and then another, forming an eerie chorus that seemed to surround them from multiple directions at once. "Rogue wolves," Callum said grimly, his grip tightening on his sword. "We need to find shelter quickly, somewhere defensible, where we can wait until daylight returns." They moved quickly through the darkening forest, searching for any suitable place to take shelter for the night. Eventually, they discovered a small rocky outcropping, partially hollowed by natural erosion, offering some protection from potential attacks, while still allowing them to monitor their surroundings. Callum worked quickly to build a small fire, using dry wood he had gathered earlier, hoping the flames would help deter any curious predators from approaching too closely during the night. "Try to rest," he told Ren as the fire finally caught, casting flickering orange light across the small rocky shelter. "I will keep watch through the first portion of the night. We can trade off if needed." Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come easily for Ren, her mind too full of fear and anticipation to allow genuine rest. She lay curled near the small fire, listening to the distant howls echoing periodically through the darkness, each one sending fresh waves of anxiety through her chest. Somewhere out there in the twisted forest, dangerous creatures hunted through the night, and somewhere far behind her, in a palace dungeon she could no longer reach easily, a chained king continued fighting against a curse that threatened to destroy him completely. She thought of Alaric's exhausted, grateful smile, the quiet strength he had shown despite his suffering, and found herself drawing courage from that memory, even as fear pressed heavily against her chest. Whatever dangers waited in the darkness surrounding their small camp, she could not allow fear to overwhelm her determination now, not when they had already traveled so far and risked so much to reach this point. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her anxiety, and Ren drifted into a restless, shallow sleep, her dreams filled with fragmented images of chains and shadows and amber eyes watching her from the darkness. She woke sometime later to Callum gently shaking her shoulder, his expression tense in the dim firelight. "Something is out there," he whispered urgently, "watching us. I have seen movement at the edge of the firelight several times now." Ren sat up immediately, her heart pounding as she scanned the darkness beyond their small camp. For a moment, she saw nothing but shifting shadows among the twisted trees. Then, gradually, she began to make out a pair of glowing eyes staring back at them from the darkness, low to the ground, unmistakably belonging to some large predatory creature. "Do not move suddenly," Callum instructed quietly, positioning himself protectively between Ren and the watching creature, his sword raised and ready. "Rogue wolves respond to sudden movement as a challenge. We need to remain calm and let it decide we are not worth the risk of attacking." The tense standoff stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the glowing eyes never blinking, never moving closer, but never retreating either. Ren's entire body trembled with adrenaline and fear, though she forced herself to remain as still and quiet as possible, trusting Callum's experience and knowledge to guide them safely through this dangerous encounter. Finally, after several agonizing minutes, the glowing eyes blinked once, and then disappeared entirely into the darkness, the creature apparently deciding that whatever meal they might provide was not worth the risk of challenging an armed, alert opponent. Callum let out a slow breath of relief, though he remained tense and watchful for several more minutes before finally lowering his sword slightly. "That was close," he murmured, glancing back at Ren with obvious concern. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Ren said, though her voice trembled slightly with lingering adrenaline. "How much further until we reach the Hollow Stones?" Callum consulted the map again, studying it carefully in the dim firelight. "If Edwin's calculations are accurate, we should reach the location by tomorrow evening, assuming we encounter no further delays or dangers along the way." Ren nodded, settling back against the rocky shelter, though sleep felt impossible to reclaim after such a frightening encounter. She spent the remaining hours of darkness sitting alert beside Callum, both of them keeping careful watch as the fire burned lower, until finally, the first pale light of dawn began filtering weakly through the twisted canopy above them. As morning arrived, bringing with it a slightly less oppressive atmosphere than the deep darkness of night, Ren felt a renewed sense of determination settling over her exhaustion. They had survived their first night within the Blackthorn Wilds, avoided the first dangerous encounter with the forest's rogue predators, and remained on course toward their ultimate goal. Whatever additional dangers waited ahead as they continued their journey deeper into this twisted, unforgiving forest, Ren understood clearly that turning back now was simply not an option. Too much depended on their success, and too many people, an entire kingdom desperate for its true king to reclaim his rightful throne, waited anxiously for their return. They gathered their few supplies, extinguished the remains of their small fire, and continued forward into the depths of the Blackthorn Wilds, each step carrying them closer to the Hollow Stones and the rare cure that represented their only hope of saving King Alaric from the curse, threatening to destroy him completely. The second day within the Blackthorn Wilds proved far more difficult than the first. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, uneven ground hidden beneath thick layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots that seemed to reach upward deliberately, catching at their feet with every careless step. The twisted black trees grew closer together the deeper they traveled, forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead that blocked nearly all natural light, leaving them to navigate through a perpetual gray twilight, regardless of the actual hour. Ren found herself struggling more than she wanted to admit, her body aching from the previous day's long march and the poor, restless sleep that had followed their frightening encounter with the watching predator. Callum noticed her difficulty, but said nothing directly, instead adjusting their pace slightly and suggesting more frequent brief rests, careful not to embarrass her by drawing attention to her exhaustion. "The map suggests we should reach a small stream sometime this afternoon," he said during one such rest, studying Edwin's careful notes. "If it still exists as marked, we can refill our water supplies there before continuing toward the Hollow Stones." They pressed onward through the difficult terrain, the oppressive silence of the forest broken only by their own footsteps and occasional distant sounds that neither of them could confidently identify. Strange rustling movements in the underbrush, faint cracking sounds high in the twisted canopy above, sounds that kept both travelers constantly alert and tense. By mid-afternoon, they finally reached the stream Edwin's map had promised, a narrow but fast-moving channel of dark water cutting through the forest floor. As they knelt to refill their water containers, Ren noticed strange markings carved into several nearby trees, symbols she did not recognize, clearly ancient and deliberately placed. "What do you make of these?" she asked, gesturing toward the carved symbols. Callum studied them carefully, his expression troubled. "I am not certain, but similar markings sometimes indicate territorial boundaries among certain wolf packs, particularly rogue packs that have abandoned traditional pack structures. If that is what these represent, we may be approaching territory claimed by a group far more organized and dangerous than a single lone predator." The warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. As they continued following the stream deeper into the forest, searching for a suitable crossing point, they began hearing movement around them, careful and deliberate, unlike the random rustling they had grown accustomed to throughout their journey. Callum stopped suddenly, his hand raised in a silent signal for Ren to remain still. "We are being followed," he whispered, his eyes scanning the twisted trees surrounding them. Multiple creatures, moving with clear coordination. Ren's heart pounded rapidly as she tried to identify any sign of their pursuers among the dense shadows, but the twisted forest made it nearly impossible to spot anything clearly until it wanted to be seen. Slowly, from multiple directions simultaneously, dark shapes began emerging from the shadows. 4 large wolves, their fur matted and wild, their eyes carrying none of the intelligent awareness she remembered from ordinary pack wolves, but instead, a cold, calculating hunger that made her blood run cold. "Rogue pack," Callum confirmed grimly, positioning himself protectively in front of Ren, his sword raised defensively. "Stay behind me, and do not run. Running will only trigger their hunting instincts more aggressively." The 4 wolves circled slowly, cautious but clearly coordinated, testing the perimeter of the 2 travelers without yet committing to a direct attack. Ren's mind raced desperately, searching for any option beyond simply trusting Callum's sword to protect them against 4 dangerous predators simultaneously. "The stream," she whispered urgently, remembering something Edwin had mentioned in passing during his research. Wolves, even rogue ones, generally avoid deep, fast-moving water unless absolutely desperate. If we can reach the deeper section further downstream, it might discourage them from pursuing. Callum nodded slightly, understanding her suggestion immediately. "Move slowly toward the water, but do not turn your back on them completely." They began edging carefully toward the stream, moving in careful, deliberate steps rather than sudden movements that might trigger an aggressive response from the circling wolves. The predators seemed to sense their intention, growing more agitated, one of them releasing a low, threatening growl that echoed unsettlingly through the surrounding trees. Just as they neared the stream's edge, the largest of the 4 wolves lunged forward suddenly, apparently deciding the potential prey was about to escape and no longer worth the caution of continued observation. Callum reacted instantly, positioning himself between the charging predator and Ren, his sword meeting the wolf's attack with practiced skill, honed through years of guard training. The confrontation that followed happened in a chaotic blur of motion, growling predators and Callum's desperate defensive maneuvers, Ren backing steadily toward the deeper water while trying to stay close enough to offer whatever help she could. She grabbed a fallen branch from the forest floor, wielding it clumsily as a makeshift weapon, though her hands trembled with fear and adrenaline. Callum fought skillfully, managing to keep the immediate threat contained, despite facing multiple opponents simultaneously. But Ren could see the exhaustion and strain beginning to show in his movements as the confrontation stretched onward. One of the wolves circled around behind him, clearly attempting to flank his defensive position, while the others kept his attention focused forward. "Behind you," Ren shouted urgently, watching in horror as the flanking wolf prepared to lunge. Callum turned just in time, but the sudden movement left him momentarily vulnerable to the wolf he had been engaging directly, its jaws snapping dangerously close to his exposed side. Without thinking clearly, driven purely by instinct and desperate fear for her companion's safety, Ren rushed forward and swung her makeshift branch with all the strength she could summon, striking the nearest wolf across its flank with enough force to startle it backward, buying Callum the precious seconds he needed to regain his defensive stance. The unexpected assistance seemed to shift something in the confrontation's dynamic, the wolves apparently reconsidering their assessment of easy prey now that both travelers had demonstrated unexpected willingness to fight back. After several more tense moments of circling and testing, the largest wolf let out a frustrated growl and retreated slightly, the others following its lead, until finally all 4 predators withdrew into the surrounding shadows, apparently deciding the potential meal was not worth the continued risk and effort. Ren and Callum remained tense and alert for several long minutes after the wolves disappeared, neither trusting the sudden silence to represent genuine safety rather than a temporary retreat. Eventually, when no further threat materialized, Callum lowered his sword slowly, breathing heavily from the exertion of the confrontation. "That was reckless," he said, though his tone carried more relief and gratitude than genuine criticism. "But it likely saved my life. Thank you." Ren, still trembling from adrenaline and fear, managed a shaky smile. "I could not simply stand by and watch you face them alone." They took several minutes to catch their breath and assess any injuries sustained during the confrontation. Callum had a shallow cut along his forearm, where one of the wolves had managed to catch him briefly, though the wound appeared minor and easily treatable with the basic supplies Edwin had provided. Ren, though physically unharmed, found her hands still shaking uncontrollably from the intensity of the encounter, the reality of how close they had come to serious injury or death finally settling over her. "We should continue moving," Callum said eventually, cleaning and bandaging his minor wound with practiced efficiency. Rogue packs often regroup and attempt pursuit again if they sense continued weakness or vulnerability. "We need to put distance between ourselves and this territory before they decide we are worth pursuing further." They pressed forward with renewed urgency, crossing the stream at its deepest, fastest-moving point, and continuing their journey toward the hollow stones with heightened caution. The encounter with the rogue pack had shaken Ren deeply, forcing her to confront directly the genuine physical danger of their mission in a way that abstract knowledge and careful planning had not fully prepared her for. Yet despite the fear still lingering in her chest, Ren also felt something new settling alongside that fear, a growing confidence in her own capability that she had never experienced before. She had not simply survived the encounter passively, relying entirely on Callum's protection. She had acted, had made a difference in the outcome through her own courage and quick thinking, striking the flanking wolf at exactly the moment Callum needed the distraction most. As evening approached once again, casting the twisted forest into even deeper shadow, they finally reached a location matching Edwin's description of the approach to the hollow stones. A natural clearing marked by several large, ancient standing stones, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, their weathered surfaces covered in moss and strange, faded carvings, similar to those they had encountered near the stream. "We are close now," Callum said, studying the ancient stones with evident awe despite his exhaustion. According to Edwin's research, the Moonveil root should grow somewhere within this immediate area, likely near the base of the largest stone formation. Ren felt a surge of renewed hope and determination as she surveyed the mysterious clearing, the ancient stones standing silent and watchful in the fading evening light. They had survived the dangerous journey through the forest's outer territories, endured a frightening confrontation with rogue predators, and finally reached the location that held their best hope of saving King Alaric from the curse, threatening to destroy him. Whatever challenges remained ahead as they searched for the rare healing root among these ancient stones, Ren understood that they had already proven, through their survival and their courage during the wolf encounter, that they possessed the strength and determination necessary to complete this impossible mission. The hardest part of their journey, she suspected, still waited ahead of them, but for the first time since entering the Blackthorn Wilds, she allowed herself to believe genuinely that success remained within their reach. Darkness settled fully over the clearing of ancient stones as Ren and Callum began their careful search for the Moonveil root, using the last of the fading evening light, along with a small lantern to examine the ground around the base of each towering formation. Edwin's notes had described the plant carefully: pale silver leaves that seemed to glow faintly under moonlight, small white flowers that bloomed only in complete darkness, and roots that ran deep beneath rocky soil, difficult to extract without proper care and patience. "Here," Callum called quietly after nearly an hour of careful searching, kneeling beside the base of the largest standing stone. "I believe this matches Edwin's description." Ren hurried over, kneeling beside him to examine the small cluster of pale, silvery plants growing in a shadowed crevice at the stone's base. As she watched, one of the small white flowers slowly unfurled its petals in the deepening darkness, giving off a faint, ethereal glow that confirmed exactly what Edwin's research had described. "This is it," she breathed, relief and excitement flooding through her exhausted body. "The Moonveil root." They worked carefully together to extract the plant, following Edwin's detailed instructions precisely to ensure they preserved the delicate roots intact and undamaged. The soil around the base of the stone proved rocky and difficult to work with, requiring patient, careful digging rather than the quick, forceful extraction that might have damaged the fragile roots beyond usefulness. As Ren dug carefully with a small tool from her supply pack, working to loosen the rocky soil surrounding the deepest portion of the root system, she failed to notice a section of ground near the stone's base that had been weakened by years of erosion and root growth beneath the surface. Without warning, the ground beneath her shifted suddenly, crumbling away beneath her weight, and she found herself falling into a hidden crevice that opened unexpectedly beneath the ancient stone. "Ren!" Callum's shout echoed with alarm as she disappeared from view, tumbling several feet down into a narrow, rocky opening she had not even known existed. She landed hard against uneven stone, pain flaring sharply through her shoulder and along her side, where she had struck the rocky ground during her fall. For a moment, she lay stunned, the wind knocked from her lungs, unable to process anything beyond the sharp, immediate pain radiating through her body. "Ren! Are you all right?" Callum's voice called down from above, tight with worry. "I am here," she managed to call back, her voice strained with pain as she carefully tested her limbs, relieved to find nothing appeared broken, despite the significant impact of her fall. "I think I am all right, though my shoulder hurts badly." "Do not move too much," Callum instructed urgently. "I am going to find a way down to help you." While she waited, Ren took several careful breaths, trying to steady herself, despite the throbbing pain in her shoulder and the sharp ache along her ribs, where she had struck the rocky ground. As her eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness of the small underground chamber she had fallen into, she noticed something unexpected: a dense cluster of moonveil root growing along the chamber's shadowed walls, far more extensive than the small patch they had discovered at the surface. Despite her pain, Ren felt a surge of hope at this discovery. If she could gather additional root from this hidden underground growth, they would have more than enough to prepare a proper cure, perhaps even enough to preserve some for future need, should the palace healers require it again. She heard Callum's careful movements above as he searched for a safer way down to reach her, eventually finding a narrow, natural pathway along the side of the crevice that allowed him to descend more safely than her accidental fall had permitted. He reached her side within several minutes, his expression tight with concern as he knelt beside her, examining her shoulder carefully in the dim lantern light he carried. "This looks painful, but I do not believe it is broken," he said after careful examination, his fingers gentle despite his obvious worry. "Likely a severe bruise, perhaps a partial dislocation. We should bind it carefully to prevent further injury, but you should be able to continue moving, even if it causes considerable discomfort." "I found more of the root," Ren said, gesturing toward the dense growth along the chamber walls despite the pain evident in her voice. "Enough to prepare a stronger cure than we originally hoped for." Callum glanced toward the additional growth, his expression shifting to cautious relief. "That is good news, though we should not risk staying in this hidden chamber longer than absolutely necessary. This location may hold other dangers we have not yet discovered." Working carefully despite her injured shoulder, Ren helped Callum gather additional samples of the moonveil root, wrapping each carefully in protective cloth to preserve its delicate properties for the journey back to the palace. The pain in her shoulder made the work slow and difficult, each movement sending sharp reminders of her fall, but she pushed through the discomfort, understanding clearly how much depended on gathering sufficient quantities of this rare, life-saving plant. Once they had collected what Callum judged to be more than enough root for their purposes, he helped Ren carefully climb back toward the surface, supporting her weight as much as possible to protect her injured shoulder from further strain. The climb proved difficult and painful, but eventually they emerged back into the clearing of ancient stones, now bathed in pale, silvery moonlight that had broken through the forest canopy overhead. "We need to bind your shoulder properly and rest before beginning our journey back," Callum said, guiding her toward a relatively sheltered area near the base of one of the smaller standing stones. "You have pushed through significant pain to help complete this mission, but continuing to travel without proper care could worsen the injury considerably." Ren did not argue, the accumulated exhaustion and pain of the entire journey finally catching up with her fully, now that their immediate goal had been accomplished. Callum worked carefully to bind her shoulder using strips of cloth from their supplies, his movements practiced and gentle despite his obvious concern for causing her additional pain. "You did well tonight," he said quietly, as he finished binding her injury, settling back to build a small fire for warmth and light. "Despite the fall, despite the pain, you continued helping gather what we needed. That took real strength and determination." Ren managed a tired, pained smile despite her exhaustion. "I could not simply lie there while our entire mission remained unfinished. Too many people depend on our success." They spent the remainder of that night resting carefully near the ancient stones, taking turns keeping watch despite their exhaustion, wary of any remaining dangers that might still lurk within this mysterious clearing. Ren's shoulder throbbed painfully throughout the night, making genuine rest difficult, but the knowledge that they had successfully completed the most crucial part of their dangerous mission provided a comforting counterbalance to her physical discomfort. As dawn finally broke over the ancient stones, casting soft golden light across the clearing that had, only hours before, seemed so shadowed and mysterious, Ren felt a renewed sense of purpose despite her lingering pain. They had faced genuine danger throughout their journey, confronted rogue predators, navigated treacherous terrain, and now she had survived a painful fall that could have proven far more serious than it ultimately had. Yet through every challenge, she had discovered strength within herself that she had never previously recognized, capabilities that years of being dismissed and underestimated within the palace had never given her the opportunity to demonstrate. The journey through the Blackthorn Wilds had tested her in ways she could not have imagined when she first decided to help her chained king, but it had also revealed, clearly and undeniably, that she possessed far more courage and resilience than anyone, including herself, had previously believed possible. "We should begin our journey back as soon as you feel ready," Callum said as they packed their remaining supplies, carefully securing the precious Moonvale route for the difficult journey ahead. "Every day we delay is another day His Majesty continues suffering, and another day Draven strengthens his position within the palace." Ren nodded, gathering her resolve despite the pain still radiating from her injured shoulder. "I am ready. Let us return home and save our king." Together, they set out from the clearing of ancient stones, leaving behind the mysterious hollow stones that had tested them so severely, but ultimately provided the precious cure they had traveled so far to find. Ahead of them waited the long, dangerous journey back through the Blackthorn Wilds, followed by whatever new challenges awaited them within a palace, increasingly controlled by a man determined to claim a throne that was never rightfully his. But for the first time since beginning this entire dangerous mission, Ren felt genuine confidence that they would succeed, that they would return to the palace in time to save King Alaric from the curse threatening to destroy him completely, and that together, they might finally expose Draven's terrible betrayal for the entire kingdom to witness clearly. The journey back through the Blackthorn Wilds proved every bit as challenging as their initial passage into the dangerous forest, made even more difficult now by Ren's injured shoulder, which continued aching sharply with every step despite Callum's careful binding. They moved more slowly than they had during their approach, forced to take frequent rests to allow Ren's injury some measure of relief, though both travelers remained acutely aware that every delay increased the risk of Draven consolidating his power completely before they could return with the cure. On their second day of the return journey, as they navigated carefully through a particularly dense section of twisted trees, they encountered fresh evidence that the rogue wolf pack they had confronted earlier had not forgotten their presence in the territory. Scattered claw marks along several tree trunks, still fresh enough to show pale wood beneath torn bark, suggested the pack had been patrolling the area, possibly searching for the travelers who had proven unexpectedly resistant to their earlier hunting attempt. "We need to change our route slightly," Callum said, studying the marks carefully with a troubled expression. "If they are actively searching for us, following our original path exactly would be unwise." They adjusted their course accordingly, taking a slightly longer, but hopefully safer path that avoided the territory where they had encountered the wolves previously. The detour added significant time to their journey, but neither of them wanted to risk another confrontation, particularly with Ren's shoulder still healing and her overall strength diminished from the physical toll of their dangerous mission. Despite their caution, the forest continued presenting unexpected challenges throughout their return journey. A sudden, violent storm swept through the twisted woodland on their third night, forcing them to seek shelter beneath a rocky overhang, while heavy rain and fierce winds tore through the canopy above them. The storm delayed their progress by nearly a full day, as the already treacherous terrain became even more dangerous, with mud and flooding streams that had previously been easily crossable. Throughout these additional delays and challenges, Ren found her thoughts returning constantly to Alaric, chained in his cold cell, fighting against a curse that grew stronger with each passing day. She thought of Edwin, doing everything within his power to stabilize the king's condition using the temporary draft, hoping desperately that it would prove sufficient to sustain him until their return. She thought of Draven, undoubtedly using every day of their absence to further tighten his control over the palace, and the regional lords who would ultimately decide the kingdom's future leadership. "We are close to the forest's edge now," Callum announced, on what they calculated to be their 5th day since departing the palace, studying Edwin's map carefully as they navigated through gradually thinning trees. "Another few hours should bring us back to the main road, and from there, perhaps 2 days of travel to reach the palace." The news brought welcome relief to both exhausted travelers, though anxiety about what they might find upon their return tempered any genuine celebration. They had been absent from the palace for nearly a week now, more than enough time for Draven to have made significant progress toward permanently claiming the throne, or worse, enough time for Alaric's condition to have deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery despite Edwin's careful efforts. As they finally emerged from the twisted, shadowed boundaries of the Blackthorn Wilds into the more familiar open landscape beyond, both travelers felt a profound sense of relief at leaving behind the forest's constant dangers and oppressive atmosphere. Yet that relief quickly gave way to renewed urgency as they turned their attention toward the long journey still ahead, back toward the palace, and whatever challenges awaited them there. They traveled through the following days with as much speed as Ren's healing shoulder and their overall exhaustion would permit, stopping only briefly for essential rest and sustenance, driven forward by the constant awareness that every hour mattered enormously in their race against Draven's growing consolidation of power. Callum used his knowledge of lesser-traveled paths to avoid the main roads where Draven's scouts might still be watching for suspicious travelers, adding some additional time to their journey, but providing crucial safety from discovery. On the morning of what they calculated to be their 8th day since leaving the palace, they finally caught sight of the distant palace towers rising against the horizon, familiar and welcome after their long, dangerous absence. Relief flooded through Ren at the sight, though it was quickly tempered by anxious uncertainty about what situation they might find upon their return. "We should approach carefully," Callum said, as they drew nearer to the palace grounds. "We do not know what has changed during our absence, or whether Mira's suspicions have led to increased scrutiny that might make our return more dangerous than our departure." They circled carefully toward the same service gate they had used to leave the palace grounds initially, relieved to find it still accessible through Callum's remaining loyal contact among the guards. As they slipped quietly back into the familiar palace grounds, moving carefully through shadowed pathways to avoid unnecessary attention, Ren felt a complex mixture of emotions settling over her: relief at successfully completing their dangerous mission, anxiety about what challenges still remained ahead, and a fierce determination to see this fight through to its conclusion, regardless of whatever obstacles Draven might have prepared during their absence. Their first priority was reaching Edwin, both to deliver the precious Moonveil root and to learn exactly what had transpired within the palace during their week-long absence. They made their way carefully toward the healer's chambers, avoiding the main corridors where they might encounter unwanted attention, until finally reaching Edwin's familiar workspace. The old healer looked up as they entered, his tired face immediately transforming, with visible relief at their safe return. "Thank the old gods," he breathed, rising quickly from his chair to examine them both for obvious injuries. "I feared the worst when so much time passed without word from either of you." "We have the root," Ren said, carefully producing the carefully wrapped samples from her travel bag. "More than enough for the cure, and additional supply besides, should it ever be needed again." Edwin's eyes widened with genuine amazement as he examined the precious plant material, his weathered hands trembling slightly with excitement and relief. "This is remarkable. I was uncertain you would succeed in finding sufficient quantities, let alone survive the journey itself." He glanced up at Ren's bound shoulder with visible concern. "You are injured." "A fall during our search," Ren explained. "Nothing that will not heal properly with time." "We need to discuss what has happened here during our absence," Callum said urgently, cutting through the reunion's initial relief to address the pressing concerns that had driven their entire dangerous mission. "How is His Majesty? Has Draven made further progress toward claiming permanent regency?" Edwin's expression grew immediately more serious, the relief of their safe return giving way to renewed anxiety about the ongoing crisis within the palace. His Majesty remains stable, though weakening steadily despite the temporary draft I have been administering during my regular visits. As for Draven, I fear the news is not favorable. He has scheduled a formal council session for tomorrow evening, where he intends to present evidence he claims proves His Majesty's condition is permanent and incurable. If the council votes in his favor, as seems increasingly likely given his careful manipulation of the regional lords, he will be granted permanent regency, effectively claiming the throne in all but official title. The news hit Ren like a physical blow, the relief of their successful mission suddenly tempered by the terrifying realization of how little time remained before Draven's plan reached its devastating conclusion. Tomorrow evening. They had returned just in time, perhaps, but preparing the cure and finding a way to deliver it successfully before the council session would require moving with extraordinary speed and precision. How long will it take to prepare the antidote once we have the root properly processed? Ren asked urgently. Edwin considered the question carefully, already beginning to organize his workspace for the delicate preparation process ahead. Several hours at minimum. Given the care required to extract and properly combine the root's healing properties without diminishing its effectiveness. If I begin immediately, working through the night, I should have a properly prepared antidote ready by early tomorrow morning, well before the scheduled council session. Then we have no time to waste, Callum said firmly. Edwin, focus entirely on preparing the cure. Ren and I will find a way to ensure we can deliver it to His Majesty safely, and we will need to determine how to expose Draven's betrayal before the council session concludes with him claiming permanent regency. The three of them spent the following hours in careful, urgent planning, Edwin beginning the delicate work of preparing the antidote, while Ren and Callum discussed strategies for both delivering the cure safely and exposing Draven's conspiracy before the entire assembled council. The stakes had never felt higher, their successful journey through the dangerous Blackthorn wilds meaning nothing if they failed now, in these final crucial hours, to complete their mission before Draven's careful plan reached its devastating conclusion. As night fell over the palace once again, Edwin worked steadily by lamplight, carefully extracting and preparing the precious Moonveil root, while Ren and Callum finalized their plans for the following day, both of them acutely aware that everything they had risked and sacrificed throughout their dangerous journey would be determined by what happened within the next 24 hours. Edwin worked through the entire night without rest, his careful hands measuring and combining the precious Moonveil root with practiced precision despite his exhaustion, determined to prepare the antidote correctly on his first attempt, since no time remained for any errors or corrections. Ren and Callum took turns assisting him where possible, gathering supplies, maintaining the small fire needed for certain preparation steps, and otherwise, remaining alert for any sign that their activities might have drawn unwanted attention from Draven's growing network of loyal servants. As dawn approached, Edwin finally completed his work, carefully pouring the finished antidote into a small glass vial, its contents a pale silver liquid that seemed to shimmer faintly, even in the dim early morning light. "It is ready," he announced, exhaustion evident in every line of his weathered face. This should be sufficient to fully reverse the curse's effects, though the process itself may prove difficult and uncertain given how long the poison has already been affecting him. "We must get it to him immediately," Ren said, taking the precious vial carefully and tucking it securely into her clothing. "The council session is scheduled for this evening. If we can restore him before then, he can confront Draven directly and expose this entire conspiracy before the assembled lords." Callum nodded grimly. Getting into the dungeon without being noticed will be the greatest challenge. Draven has increased security significantly during our absence, likely as a precaution against exactly this kind of interference. They spent the remaining early morning hours carefully planning their approach, drawing on Callum's knowledge of guard rotations and Ren's familiarity with the palace's hidden service passages. Eventually, they settled on a plan that would use the same narrow maintenance corridor Ren had discovered during her first secret visit to Alaric's cell, timing their approach carefully to coincide with a brief gap in guard rotation that Callum's remaining loyal contacts had confirmed would occur shortly after midday. As the appointed hour approached, Ren felt her nerves stretching tight with anticipation and fear. So much depended on this final, crucial step of their long, dangerous mission. If they were discovered now, after everything they had already sacrificed and risked throughout their journey, Draven would undoubtedly ensure their permanent silence before they ever had the chance to save the king or expose his betrayal. They moved carefully through the familiar servant passages, Ren leading the way with confident, practiced steps, despite the tension coiled tightly in her chest. When they finally reached the small maintenance door leading into the dungeon's lowest level, Callum paused briefly, listening carefully for any sign of nearby guards before nodding to indicate it was safe to proceed. They found Alaric exactly where Ren had left him during her previous secret visit, though his condition had visibly worsened during the intervening time. His breathing came in ragged, labored gasps, and the strange half-transformation between man and wolf had progressed further, patches of fur now covering significant portions of his exposed skin, his features carrying an unsettling blend of human and wolf characteristics that spoke clearly of how close the curse had come to claiming him completely. "Your Majesty," Ren whispered urgently, kneeling beside the bars of his cell, "we have returned. We have the cure." Alaric's head lifted slowly, his amber eyes struggling to focus on her through the haze of pain and confusion that clearly gripped him. "Ren," he managed, his voice barely more than a rough whisper, "you came back." "Of course I came back," she said firmly, producing the precious vial carefully from her clothing. "I promised you we would find the cure, and we have kept that promise." Callum worked quickly to pick the lock securing the cell door, his skilled hands making short work of the mechanism despite the pressure of their limited time. Once the door swung open, Ren rushed to Alaric's side, carefully uncorking the vial and helping him drink the pale silver liquid despite his weakened, trembling state. For several agonizing moments, nothing happened, and fear gripped Ren's chest as she wondered whether the long journey and careful preparation had somehow failed, whether Alaric had already deteriorated too far for even the precious Moonveil route to save him. Then, gradually, his body began to change, the unnatural fur receding slowly back beneath his skin, his ragged breathing steadying into something more controlled and human, his amber eyes clearing further with each passing moment, until they finally focused on her, with genuine, complete clarity. "It is working," Callum breathed with evident relief, watching the transformation continue steadily. "The curse is breaking." Alaric's body continued its slow recovery over the following minutes, color returning to his previously pale skin, his labored breathing gradually settling into a more natural, steady rhythm. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the deep, steady strength Ren remembered from years ago, entirely free of the rough, strained quality that had characterized his speech during her previous visit. "I feel it," he said, flexing his hands carefully, testing their steadiness, now that the silver chains had been removed by Callum during the process. "The fog that has clouded my mind for so long is finally clearing. I remember everything now, with perfect clarity." "Your Majesty, we do not have much time," Callum said urgently, helping the recovering king to his feet, though Alaric still required support given his prolonged weakness and imprisonment. "Draven has scheduled a formal council session this evening, where he intends to claim permanent regency by presenting your condition as incurable. We need to get you prepared to confront him directly before that session concludes." Alaric's expression hardened with clear, focused anger as the full weight of his cousin's betrayal settled over him now that his mind had cleared completely. "Then we shall give him exactly the confrontation he does not expect," he said, his voice carrying renewed authority despite his physical weakness. "Help me prepare. I intend to walk into that council session myself and expose every detail of his treachery before the assembled lords." They worked quickly to help Alaric regain enough strength to move steadily, providing him with simple sustenance from their remaining supplies, while Callum retrieved appropriate clothing from a hidden cache he had arranged during his earlier preparations. As they worked, Ren explained everything they had learned throughout their investigation, the overheard conversation between Draven and the mysterious alchemist, the deliberate poisoning designed to trap him between forms, the careful, patient planning that had gone into staging his apparent madness. "This alchemist," Alaric said thoughtfully as he listened to her account. "Did you learn anything about his identity or origin?" "Only that he spoke with an accent from beyond our borders," Ren replied. "Edwin believes he may have connections to certain foreign kingdoms, known for practicing forbidden alchemy." Alaric nodded grimly, filing away this information for future investigation. Draven did not act alone in this. Whoever provided him with such dangerous knowledge and materials bears responsibility as well, and I intend to see that responsibility properly addressed once this immediate crisis has been resolved. As evening approached, bringing with it the scheduled council session that would determine the kingdom's future leadership, Alaric felt his strength continuing to return steadily, though he remained noticeably weaker than his usual formidable presence. Ren watched him carefully throughout their preparations, noting the careful control he exercised despite his understandable anger, channeling that emotion into focused, deliberate determination rather than reckless fury. "We should move toward the council chamber now," Callum said, as the appointed hour drew near. "Draven will likely have significant guard presence surrounding the session. We need to time our entrance carefully to ensure maximum impact and minimum opportunity for him to prevent your presence from being witnessed by the assembled lords." They made their way carefully through the palace's hidden passages once again, this time moving toward the Grand Council chamber, where Draven had gathered the regional lords to formalize his claim to power. As they approached, they could hear Draven's voice already addressing the assembled council, his tone smooth and persuasive, as he presented his carefully constructed case for permanent regency. "And so, my lords, given the complete absence of any improvement in my cousin's tragic condition, despite weeks of careful treatment, I believe it falls to this council to make the difficult but necessary decision regarding our kingdom's future leadership." Ren, Callum, and Alaric positioned themselves carefully near a side entrance to the grand chamber, waiting for precisely the right moment to make their entrance. Ren could feel her heart pounding with anticipation, aware that everything they had risked and sacrificed throughout their dangerous journey would culminate in these final, crucial moments. "Are you ready, Your Majesty?" Callum asked quietly. Alaric straightened to his full height, despite his lingering weakness, his expression settling into the composed, authoritative bearing that had once commanded genuine respect throughout the entire kingdom. "I have never been more ready," he said firmly. "It is time my cousin learned exactly how far his treachery has failed." With that, King Alaric Vantor stepped forward, pushing open the grand chamber doors and walking directly into the astonished silence that immediately fell over the assembled council, his presence alone announcing clearly, without a single word needing to be spoken, that Draven's carefully constructed plan had just begun to unravel completely. The Grand Council chamber fell into complete, stunned silence as King Alaric Vantor strode through the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his still recovering strength. The assembled regional lords, who only moments before had been listening attentively to Draven's carefully constructed argument for permanent regency, now stared in open shock at the very king they had been told was hopelessly lost to madness, standing before them clear-eyed and unmistakably in complete control of his faculties. Draven, standing near the head of the council table, went visibly pale, his composed expression cracking for just a moment before he quickly attempted to recover his careful mask of concerned regency. "Cousin," he said, his voice betraying only the slightest tremor of surprise, "this is unexpected. We were told your condition remained unchanged, that recovery was no longer considered possible." "Clearly, cousin, you were told incorrectly," Alaric replied, his deep voice carrying easily throughout the silent chamber as he walked steadily toward the head of the table, Ren and Callum remaining close behind him. "Or perhaps, more accurately, you deliberately misled this entire council regarding a condition you yourself arranged." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembled lords at this direct accusation. Draven's expression hardened, though he maintained his composed tone with obvious effort. "That is a serious accusation, Your Majesty. I have done everything within my power to manage this kingdom responsibly during your unfortunate illness." "An illness you created," Alaric said firmly, "through poison administered deliberately during our council meeting, several weeks ago, with the assistance of a foreign alchemist, skilled in forbidden compounds, designed specifically to trap a shifter between forms." The chamber erupted into louder murmurs and exclamations, several of the regional lords exchanging shocked, uncertain glances as they processed this startling accusation against the man who had been carefully cultivating their trust and support throughout the preceding weeks. Draven's composure finally began cracking more visibly under the weight of the direct confrontation. "These are baseless claims," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smooth confidence. "You have clearly not fully recovered from whatever affliction gripped you, Your Majesty, if you believe such wild accusations against your own family." "I have evidence," Alaric replied calmly, gesturing toward Ren and Callum, who stepped forward at his signal. "This young woman overheard your private conversation with the alchemist you employed, discussing the compound used against me, and the specific cure required to reverse its effects. She and my loyal guard here traveled into the Blackthorn Wilds themselves, at great personal risk, to retrieve that very cure, which now sits properly documented and available for any healer in this kingdom to verify." Edwin Marsh, who had been waiting quietly near the chamber entrance, stepped forward at this moment, carrying with him detailed notes documenting his examination of the strange residue found in the king's blood, along with careful records of the antidote's preparation and successful administration. "I can confirm every detail of this account, my lords," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a respected healer who had served the palace faithfully for many years. "The compound found in His Majesty's blood matches no known natural illness. It was a deliberately engineered poison, and its effects have now been successfully reversed through an antidote prepared from a rare plant found only in the northern wilderness." The regional lords exchanged increasingly troubled glances as the weight of this evidence settled over the chamber. Draven's carefully constructed narrative of tragic, unavoidable illness crumbling steadily beneath the accumulated testimony and documentation presented before them. "This is absurd," Draven insisted, though desperation had begun creeping into his voice as he recognized how thoroughly his plan was unraveling before the assembled council. A servant girl and a dismissed guard, conspiring with an aging healer to fabricate wild accusations against a loyal regent who has done nothing but protect this kingdom during a genuine crisis. "Loyal regent," Alaric repeated, his tone carrying dangerous quiet anger now. "You chained me like an animal, Draven. You silenced witnesses, dismissed loyal guards, and manipulated this entire council with careful lies, all so you could claim a throne that was never yours to take. I trusted you. I gave you authority and responsibility beyond what any cousin deserved, and you repaid that trust by attempting to destroy me completely." One of the eldest regional lords, a stern woman named Beatrice Holloway, who had served on the council for many years and had known Alaric's father before him, rose slowly from her seat, her sharp eyes studying both cousins carefully. "Your Majesty," she said formally, "if these accusations prove accurate, they represent a betrayal of the gravest possible nature. However, given the serious weight of such claims, I believe this council requires more thorough investigation before rendering any final judgment." "A thorough investigation is exactly what I intend to provide," Alaric said, turning to address the entire assembled council directly. "I propose we begin immediately by questioning the alchemist responsible for creating this poison, whom I believe remains somewhere within this kingdom's borders, likely still receiving payment from my cousin for services rendered. I also propose examining the palace records regarding the servant who disappeared immediately following my collapse, the very man who poured the poisoned drink that began this entire conspiracy." Draven's face had grown increasingly pale throughout this exchange, the careful composure he had maintained for weeks finally beginning to crumble entirely under the mounting weight of evidence and accusation. Several guards positioned near the chamber's entrance, men who Ren recognized from Callum's earlier reports as still maintaining loyalty to the true king despite Draven's attempts to replace the palace guard with his own trusted appointees, moved subtly closer to Draven's position, awaiting Alaric's command. "Cousin," Alaric said, his voice softening slightly, though the underlying steel remained unmistakable, "you had every opportunity to come to me honestly with whatever grievances or ambitions drove you toward this betrayal. Instead, you chose poison and chains and lies. This council will now determine your fate according to proper law, but know that whatever punishment results from your actions, it stems entirely from choices you made freely, choices that betrayed not only me, but this entire kingdom, and everyone who trusted you." Draven's shoulders slumped slightly as the full reality of his failed conspiracy settled over him, the ambitious confidence that had carried him through weeks of careful manipulation finally giving way to the recognition that his plan had ultimately failed. The loyal guards moved forward at Alaric's subtle signal, taking Draven into custody as the assembled council watched in stunned silence, the dramatic reversal of fortune playing out before their eyes, in ways none of them could have anticipated when they first gathered for what they believed would be a routine formalization of regency. As guards escorted Draven from the chamber, the assembled regional lords began speaking urgently among themselves, processing the sudden, dramatic revelation that had unfolded before them. Lady Beatrice rose again, addressing Alaric directly with formal respect. "Your Majesty, this council owes you a sincere apology for our willingness to accept Lord Draven's claims so readily. We should have demanded more thorough investigation before considering such drastic changes to the kingdom's leadership." "Your caution during a genuine crisis was understandable, Lady Beatrice," Alaric replied graciously, though exhaustion had begun visibly creeping into his expression now that the immediate confrontation had concluded successfully. "What matters now is that truth has finally been revealed, and this kingdom can move forward under its rightful leadership." As the council session gradually concluded, the regional lords departing to spread word throughout their respective territories of the dramatic events they had witnessed, Alaric turned finally toward Ren, who had remained quietly near the chamber's edge throughout the entire confrontation, watching everything unfold with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief that their dangerous mission had truly succeeded. "Ren," he said, approaching her directly as the chamber slowly emptied of its remaining occupants, "words cannot adequately express the debt I owe you. You risked everything, your position, your safety, your very life, to save a king you barely knew, based on nothing more than a single small kindness shown years ago." "You would have done the same for me, Your Majesty," Ren replied, though a warm flush of pride colored her cheeks at his direct, sincere gratitude. "I simply did what I believed was right." "Many people believe many things are right," Alaric said, "but few possess the courage to act on those beliefs, when doing so requires such tremendous personal risk. You are remarkable, Ren, in ways this kingdom has clearly failed to recognize or properly value." He paused, studying her carefully. "I intend to correct that failure, beginning immediately. Your bravery and loyalty deserve recognition and reward, far beyond what your current position within this palace has ever offered you." Over the following days, as the kingdom gradually settled following the dramatic revelation of Draven's betrayal, Alaric worked steadily to restore proper order throughout the palace and surrounding territories. The alchemist responsible for creating the poison was eventually located and brought to justice, revealing through careful questioning the full extent of Draven's careful planning and the foreign connections that had enabled his conspiracy. Draven himself faced formal judgment before the assembled council, his punishment determined according to the kingdom's established laws regarding treason and attempted usurpation. Throughout this period of restoration and justice, Alaric made good on his promise to properly recognize Ren's courage and loyalty. She was formally honored before the entire palace court, her role in saving the kingdom's rightful king acknowledged publicly and completely, a dramatic transformation from her previous years of quiet, unnoticed service. Callum, similarly, was reinstated to his position as royal guard, promoted significantly in recognition of his crucial role throughout their dangerous mission. But beyond the formal recognition and rewards, something else had begun growing steadily between Ren and Alaric during the weeks that followed his restoration, a connection built not on royal duty or servant obligation, but on genuine mutual respect and understanding, forged through shared danger and unwavering courage. Alaric found himself seeking her counsel regularly on palace matters, valuing her sharp observations and careful judgment, qualities that years of being overlooked and underestimated had ironically sharpened rather than diminished. One evening, several months after the dramatic council confrontation that had exposed Draven's betrayal, Alaric found Ren walking alone through the palace gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. He approached quietly, standing beside her as they both admired the peaceful scene. "I have been thinking," he said eventually, "about everything that has happened since that terrible night in the council chamber, about how a servant girl, dismissed by nearly everyone as insignificant, proved to be the bravest, most loyal person in this entire kingdom." "I simply did what needed doing," Ren replied, though she smiled slightly at his words. "You did far more than that," Alaric said, turning to face her directly. "You saved my throne, my kingdom, and quite possibly my life. But more than that, you showed me something I had perhaps forgotten during my years focused on ruling and responsibility, that true courage and worth have nothing to do with rank or birth, or the labels this world insists on placing upon people. Ren felt her heart quicken at the sincere warmth in his voice, the genuine respect, and something deeper that had grown steadily between them throughout the months since his recovery. Your Majesty. Alaric, he corrected gently, after everything we have endured together, I believe you have more than earned the right to address me by my given name, at least when we speak privately like this. She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at this small but significant gesture of genuine equality between them. Alaric, then. They stood together in comfortable silence, as the sun continued its slow descent below the horizon, the palace gardens gradually filling with the soft, golden light of early evening. Whatever remained unspoken between them in that peaceful moment carried its own quiet promise, the beginning of something neither of them had expected when their paths first crossed years ago, during a moment of small, simple kindness, but something that had grown, through danger and courage and unwavering loyalty, into a bond neither of them intended to let fade away. The kingdom, meanwhile, continued healing steadily from the wounds of Draven's betrayal, its people gradually learning the full story of how their king had been saved, not by powerful alphas or trained soldiers alone, but by the combined courage of a servant girl, once dismissed as weak, a demoted guard who never abandoned his loyalty, and an aging healer who refused to stop searching for truth. Their story spread throughout the land, a powerful reminder that true strength often comes from unexpected places, and that the people society labels as weak or insignificant sometimes prove, when tested by genuine crisis, to be the bravest and most capable of all. King Alaric Vantor ruled his kingdom for many years afterward, guided always by the lessons learned during his darkest hour, that trust must be earned through genuine actions rather than simply assumed through rank or family connection, and that the people who truly deserved recognition and respect were often those who had spent their entire lives being overlooked by a world too quick to judge, based on labels rather than character. And Ren, once an invisible servant girl who swept floors and carried linens through palace halls that never noticed her presence, became instead a celebrated figure throughout the kingdom, remembered forever as the brave Omega who had refused to accept that being underestimated meant being incapable, and who had proven, through courage and loyalty and unwavering determination, that even the quietest, most overlooked person can rise to save an entire kingdom when the moment truly demands it.